Hello everyone, today we talk about one of the most important European monarchs of the second half of the 14th century, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, born on October the 16th, 1351, in Pavia, the old Longobarд capital and the center, still ideally, of the Italic crown that at this point had been, at least territorially speaking, taken over by the House of Visconti of Milan, that is just also a few tens of kilometers away. As you know, I made lots of videos about, well, maybe not too many, surely about northern Italy during the medieval millennium, but we have to talk more proportionally about Milan. We already did something. We also covered some other Lombard centers, more is coming, but we have to compact a bit more our content around especially the Ambrosian house, as much as it was one of the greatest powers of the era, and really consolidating the greater state among the Italian ones of this de facto also proto-Renaissance period. Gian Galeazzo Visconti emerged as one of the most formidable rulers of late medieval Italy, shaping the Visconti's dynasty legacy through ambition, cunning, and administrative innovation. As we will see today, you have already some guides to properly basic sort of Milanese power history from, in fact, exactly the mid-14th century up to the Italian wars, and something about Milan even more specifically. We will also make more about the military of Milan at this point was used to, in fact, control almost, in fact, the entirety of central and northern Italy. This is the moment of greatest peak of, in fact, Visconti expansion, de facto, infiltrating up to central Italy. We've seen it recently also in the video about Braccio, for example, the ones about medieval Perugia. The attempt of Milan at this point was to hegemonize the entire older Italic kingdom and to de facto unify the peninsula under a same single political rule that naturally was very composite at the time. We will partly see what was the institutional position of these emerging city-states that did so from within an old feudal districtuation, in which, in fact, these cities, like also Milan historically, had been very important, but the commune had been innovative, and in many ways at this point, especially in later medieval history, especially Holy Roman emperors, in exchange of Italian money, recognized these rulers as some specific vassals, and their district as proper states within the Italic kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire. Right, like we made several tens of these episodes about also some small politics, but we never made a unique video about, I don't know, the entire medieval English history, French history, etc. We have to do something also for the Italic kingdom because it's one of the most unique in its institutional development and therefore requires a bit of, consistent knowledge, at least of how politics and territorial control happens, as well as warfare, which definitely in the case of Milan is arguably the most interesting. And this talking about the Italic kingdom, not southern Italy, that also at this point actually was a might to be reckoned, and in fact went at war with these other powers quite often, as we will see now. But today's video is essentially a biography of Gian Galeazzo Visconti. You know that I started this genre only recently, because I realized that we covered basically everything in terms of types of videos, but for several years we haven't quite made biographies, nor it was military biographies of some also campaign, more evenementally oriented videos. We talked about battles, yes, but it's important to get the bigger picture as well. And so it's just one of the different types of videos that we will keep doing, of course, also as before. Ad maiora, we could say. Now, the son of Galeazzo II, Visconti, and Blanche of Savoy, sister of Amadeus II, the Count of Savoy, known as the Green Count, right? There is a bit of a mythology behind this. Gian Galeazzo was raised in the fortified Visconti Castle at Pavia, a stronghold that served as the political and cultural heart of his family's dominion. One of the things I wanted to do was also houses, right? I also started this I can't spoiler you that likely the next Italian episode is going to be about the Gonzaga, the Marquisate of Mantua, but properly about the house, because sometimes it's a bit like the case of Milan. That's why I made a medieval Milan history rather than the Visconti or the later Duchy, because these, as I just recalled, these powers stepped up in Holy Roman Imperial recognition as specific duchies, marquisates, and so on, because they had previously emerged just on the basis of the commune ruling over other communes under some kind of hierarchical mechanism. The legend I was talking about, as far as Savoy, for example, Savoy, we just said it was a county at this point, it would be elevated to a duchy, same, all right? And that emerged actually from the side of the kingdom of Burgundy, even though at this point Savoy had already taken over an important part of Piedmontese territories that were also bordering and the Visconti ones in northwestern Italy. The legend of the Green Count, this in part is a bit of a medieval and Risorgimento mythology. That is to say, there was the green, the white, and the red count, like the colors of the eventually of the modern Italian flag. There are some reference connections also with Dante's cardinal virtues. That's where basically everything stems from. These were actual heroes of knighthood, right? Savoy was essentially a French house, not quite French, or the Kingdom of France, as we just explained here. I made multiple videos about the kingdoms of Burgundy / Arles. And those are very interesting figures that I, in fact, put in the list of the to-do biographically wise. As far as Pavia is concerned, we will see it in a video about Pavia, that is actually in the communal era. Well, it's important, but in later times it sort of fell under the aegis of Milan. However, it was one of the last Lombard cities to give way to Milanese power. Even though it's so close, it fell just a few years before the same Gian Galeazzo was born. And it was, again, a great symbol as much as, the capital of the Italic kingdom, even though at this point nobody really recognized it as such, nor it was functionally. Like, usually also the emperors, we've seen it recently in the videos about, for example, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, they were normally crowned in either Monza or Milan. Well, Pavia, they're all very close to one another. But in that sense, you can appreciate how the Visconti had inherited a bit the legacy of the broader Italian kingdom, because they had hegemonized, if anything, the entire western central Po Valley, and again, branched also around. I hope this video will also clarify a bit what was the actual kind of mechanism of Visconti dominance, because it's not too easy to understand. It was, however, a big territorial state, one based on, again, Milanese hegemony, basically banking army bases. They had basically the same power the French kingdom, if not more, militarily wise. And I'm not kidding. I made multiple videos about this topic. Apparently, people do not know about this. However, it was based not on a kingdom, but on this, again, dominance over different cities that simply, at that point, literally accepted Visconti dominance by stopping to actually go to war themselves, but paying money to the Milanese. The Milanese bankers basically cashed sort of most of these local mercantile oligarchies' power. They ruled the cities through some sort of rural feudal dynasties that they knew, and they augmented their power in this fashion. However, it's still a medieval power, and as such, it has some limits that are also tied to the, in fact, as it's not a kingdom, in fact, the unprecise, say, mechanism of dynastic succession among the Visconti that routinely, in fact, engulfed the state and sort of shrank also its strategic reach, with these guys essentially fighting one another within the same family. Though records of Gian Galeazzo's early years are sparse, the environment of the Pavian court, steeped in political maneuvering and intellectual patronage, profoundly influenced his development. It's normal, in a sense, not to have much, regardless of this, very sort of documented era about people that were not necessarily going to be immediately seen as the future heirs because of the broader political unpredictability. Also, Milan, telling the truth, had a very heavy, damage in the destruction of its own archives historically, so that we know much better, about sort of minor Tuscan powers at some point and what was happening in Milan in the moment, documentarily speaking. Milan is also a bit of a militaristic power. It has this idea of positive tyranny, championed against, for example, the so-called Florentine republicanism, which in fact made it the stronger power. The poet Francesco Petrarca, a frequent visitor of the Pavese court at that point, in the mid-14th century, reportedly crafted for the young Gian Galeazzo an emblem of a dove within a radiant sun, paired with the motto "A bon toi," so good right, symbolizing the rightful legitimacy he would later assert through his rule. This may be just a legend, but of course Petrarch was very, to say the least, cultured person, had spent a lot of time in France at Avignon, the Papal Curia, and he was, as you know, great, and not just a great man of letters, the founder of humanism, of specific scripts, the greatest book collectionist of the era, multilingual genius, but also an imperial ambassador, a papal ambassador, and of course Milan is a place where in the Visconti court, a place where he would also thrive, would be naturally welcome. Now, the emblem of the dove is to be actually found later in Gian Galeazzo's coat of arms. This was attributed to Petrarch by Pier Candido de Cembrio, foreshadowing Gian Galeazzo's lifelong quest to consolidate and legitimize Visconti authority on the basis of personal rule. Again, these Visconti signs were meant properly to affirm themselves with military deeds and to strive for power within their own clan. At the age of 4, in January 1356, Gian Galeazzo was knighted by Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg in person during a visit to Milan. We talked about Charles IV's. It's one of the few characters we made a biography for, because I wanted to do something about 14th century Bohemia, and I couldn't piece too many things together at a time. We could actually make it again. And I decided, okay, well, let's talk about Charles IV instead of the region proper. And we've seen there his expeditions to Italy, also when Bohemia was ruled by his father John. He had a great also military experience there. Naturally, descending to Italy, passing from the north, required also just for the crowning and the as Italic king, that was necessary in order to go to Rome. You see, you could not even be king of Germany or France or whatever, but you must be king of Italy to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. And so the Milanese, of course, were key to that. There were always tensions, but Charles IV was also a skilled diplomat, a great, very intelligent politician. And so here, by knighting the 4-year-old Gian Galeazzo, essentially underscored through the ceremonial act his destined prominence within the dynasty as a means of imperial cooptation. From his youth, Gian Galeazzo displayed a sharp intellect and a natural aptitude for military strategy, traits that would propel him to become a statesman of unparalleled ambition and a conqueror whose vision of a unified northern Italy rivaled the emerging centralized monarchies of France and Spain. As we will see now, there are actually important connections with the French royal house. In fact, in November 1360, at the tender age of 9, Gian Galeazzo was married to Isabel of Valois, the daughter of King John II of France, the one captured at Poitiers 4 years before. We made an entire video about that battle, the masterpiece of the Black Prince. This union was orchestrated through the diplomatic mediation of the House of Savoy, that had an incredibly sort of tip-of-the-balance role in Western European politics. The marriage costing the Visconti family an extraordinary sum, estimated between 400,000 and 600,000 gold florins, was a strategic alliance aimed at bolstering Visconti influence through ties to the French crown. This historically will be also the pathway through which the French would later reclaim the legacy of the Milanese duchy during the Italian wars, a bit like they would do for Naples, where the Angevin house, the same Capetian one, had ruled. And in the chronicler Matteo Villani with indignation, because of course the Florentines did not really like that. Matteo was the brother of Giovanni, the most famous chronicler of the early to mid 14th century, died of plague. In fact, this chronicler was continued by his brother, who accused the French king of selling his daughter for profit, highlighting the transaction's exorbitant cost. By the way, the French needed to pay the ransom of the same king to the English. In fact, John would famously die in prison in London without coming back. He actually even came back on his word to France to settle some matters and then came back to prison in England, where he died. Astronomical ciphers for the king's ransom, especially the King of France's. Isabel's dowry included for the Milanese the county of Vertus in Champagne, granting Gian Galeazzo the title of Conte di Virtù in Italian. This was the Italianization of Virtus, by which he was known, in fact, in his early career, because if anything, his wife had brought this as a dower. This title not only elevated Gian Galeazzo's status, but also tied him to a prestigious French fief. I made a video about the County of Champagne, and those are some of the most productive areas ever. We also made a recent video about Reims, so if you're interested in that northeastern French region, very close to Paris, fairly close to Paris, part of the broader French crown grandeur, especially at this point, well, check my content out. This also reinforced Gian Galeazzo's cosmopolitan credentials, international standing, right? It's not like as eventually the ruler of Milan, he would lack that, but you see here how the Milanese succeed in basically tying themselves to European royalty already at this point. It's a very chaotic moment in Europe, as you know, the aftermath of the Black Death. This is the age of the soldiers of fortune. You can argue that the most concentrated Italian power at this point thrived in such chaos because with its critical mass could basically infiltrate across this very shattered region of central northern Italy. The marriage with Isabelle of Valois, however, was marked by personal tragedy. In fact, the bride died on September the 11th, 1372, during childbirth, as it was dramatically frequent, with effect Gian Galeazzo's, their fourth child, which at least, is something, Carlo, that, however, also perished. Of their four children, Gian Galeazzo II, 1366, 1376, he died at 10. Azzone, 1368-1380, Valentina, 1371, 1408, and Carlo, as we've seen here, not died at birth, but a couple of years after his, not even after his birth. Only, as you've just seen, Valentina survived to adulthood. Valentina's marriage in 1389, famously, to Louis of Valois, the Duke of Orléans, the one that was assassinated later on during the clashes between the Les Armagnacs and the Bourguignons, carried profound consequences. The aforementioned connection of the French crown and properly their claim to the inheritance of the Visconti later Sforza legacy. In fact, Valentina's dowry, which included the county of Asti in Piedmont, I made a video about medieval Asti, by the way, if you're interested, and succession rights to Milan in the absence of male heirs to Gian Galeazzo, provided a legal basis for, again, the French claims due to the same Duchy of Milan under Louis XII in 1499. During the Italian wars, a lingering shadow over Gian Galeazzo's legacy, and a huge deal historically. Imagine, like we say, after the 100 Years' War, the French recompacted France and then immediately vied for Italy, essentially. But everybody knew since Heredith, of course, with Valentina's marriage to the Duke of Orleans, and admittedly, yes, also the later descendants, there was within the large and prolific Capetian house the Valois claim to, in fact, such inheritance in Italy. Like Naples, still at this point, was in French hands, but later, like imagine, like basically the most important states in the Italian peninsula at that point claimed by the French by dynastic right, and not even with simply some sort of fantasy or, surely opportunism, but it's not like they made that up. Gian Galeazzo's political career began to take shape in the early 70s of the 14th century as he assumed greater responsibilities under his father's guidance. His first military engagement came in 1372 when he led an unsuccessful attempt to besiege the aforementioned Asti, then held by the House of Savoy, revealing his inexperience at the time. The following year, at the Battle of Montichiari, on May 7, 1373, he suffered a wounding defeat against Savoyard forces, a setback that underscored his early limitations as a commander once again. However, these experiences honed his strategic acumen. On March 9th, 1374, his father granted him the authority to negotiate with the same Amadeus VI of Savoy, leading to the Peace of Casale Monferrato on June 6th, 1374, which delineated spheres of influence between the Visconti and Savoy. Historically speaking, it was just a couple of generations. Basically, these powers were facing each other in the Western Po Valley, mostly through proxy warfare, right? And the signory sort of projected on this or that commune in an area that was fairly frontier-like. Piedmont in some areas was developed, but Asti, for example, was essentially literally the biggest, most important center. And so something much more modest compared to Lombardy, right? It was next door, but still sort of brought also this difference, the delineation between Piedmont and Lombardy, because historically this didn't even technically exist. Some Piedmontese cities today are basically were in medieval Lombardy historically. It was a much wider concept at some point, narrowed down by the more sort of stringent boundaries traced by the Visconti, also with these powers. By January the 8th, 1375, Galeazzo II, his father, emancipated Gian Galeazzo, entrusting him with the governance of Novara, Vercelli, Alessandria, Tortona, Valenza, and Casale, which are in fact Piedmontese today. While reserved, so this is a great Western mark of some sort. While reserving Pavia, Como, Piacenza, Bobbio, there are in across the Po River in either Lombardy and Emilia, depending on which city. We haven't covered these yet. I was talking about Piacenza recently for the video about Bologna, just because we made Parma, and again we have to, and Modena as well, so we have to complete the last time. In fact, I forgot to mention, having already covered the broader Emilian space, we need Piacenza and Reggio. Gian Galeazzo received on this occasion also the title of Dominus Generalis for himself. So a sort of, the Italians were inventive exactly because there wasn't a fixed feudal hierarchy here. These lords could create their own titles. And Dominus Generalis means some sort of here commander-in-chief, especially this frontier area from a military point of view. All right. This division prepared Gian Galeazzo for leadership, culminating in his inheritance of the signory of Pavia upon his father's death on August the 4th, 1378, in the Visconti castle at Pavia. The death of Galeazzo II thrust Gian Galeazzo into a precarious co-rule of the Visconti dominions with his uncle Bernabò. This was, again, quite typical, brothers, uncles, also for other houses, right? Because, again, there wasn't a fixed inheritance law of sort, and Italians still reason in terms of being lords of this or that power, especially of different cities, as we've seen, in a condition of power sharing of some sort while maintaining some more personal power. Bernabò was a domineering and ruthless figure. At some point we will cover him as well. He was also a great commander whose favoritism towards his numerous legitimate and illegitimate children sparked immediate tensions with Gian Galeazzo. Bernabò's ambition to marry one of his sons to Maria, the young Queen of Sicily. These were the Aragonese who succeeded her father Frederick IV in 1377, clashed with Gian Galeazzo's own designs to secure the Sicilian crown for his son Azzone. This is incredibly interesting. It was a clash with his uncle, cousins, and there is a Visconti projection on the Mediterranean. The Visconti will essentially remain historically a very terrestrial power. Yes, they will control Genoa at this point, also under Gian Galeazzo, among other members of the house. They will have thus some broader projection also in Corsica and other also coastal areas. But it's fascinating that they were contemplating this possible dynastic switch that wouldn't happen, in fact, for the crown of Sicily, which would also be, you see, a Philo-French policy from the side of Gian Galeazzo, because that was essentially helping the Angevins of Naples against their Atavic rivals across the Straits of Messina. And in this sense, different European houses were backing this or that ruler to sort of facilitate, at least in also quite tactically, contingently, in the moment somebody that namely claimed to go against, to be more favorable to their own cause, like in this case, Bernabò, the Aragonese one, even though when arriving to power, as it always happens, the single ruler follows the general strategic advantage of the broader power. Not always. Remember that it's because of the Milanese that the Aragonese first failed to invade Naples and then got it, right? The Visconti had enormous power. Supported by papal overtures, Gian Galeazzo sought to advance his lineage's prestige, but the plan was thwarted by opposition from Popes Gregory XI and Urban VI, the Aragonese, for the reasons we just explained, and even Bernabò's Bavarian allies, particularly Stephen of Bavaria, that was married to Bernabò's daughter. To consolidate his control, Bernabò orchestrated a double marriage in 1380. Gian Galeazzo wed Bernabò's daughter, Caterina, in the chapel of the Visconti castle, and his sister Violante married Bernabò's son, Ludovico. This naturally was a bit of a daring union, given the close parentage, but it was a way to share power. Here, what, for example, we highlighted with that branch of the Wittelsbachs opposing themselves to a united Milan, is because, generally speaking, also the Habsburgs were against whichever power ruled in northeastern Italy, preferably, and in this sense, the Milanese were the better allies. So it works all like this. There's also the matter of the Alpine passes, as we've seen. There is also a Bohemian connection with Milan, and the Wittelsbachs feel a bit threatened at some point, or at least they have the preferential control on the Alpine passes. So it's an incredibly complicated picture. The Alpine passes are largely dominated, not by Milan entirely, but a great part of the Alpine arc, and in any case to essentially reach Milan for the aforementioned reasons of being crowned as king of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor from the side of the Germanic rulers. The aforementioned unions aimed to subordinate Gian Galeazzo to Bernabò's primacy as major domus, ensuring the dominance of Bernabò's line. To counter this, Gian Galeazzo secured the title of Imperial Vicar from Wenceslaus of Bohemia, where on January 17, 1380. This is a major and critical move that bolstered Gian Galeazzo's legitimacy and shielded him from Bernabò's claims, internationally wise. The Imperial Vicariate is an incredibly important historiographical topic, because this is literally how German rulers, especially at this point, but also before, like in any case, they had to come back to Germany at a point. They had to identify, to recognize a specific, in fact, imperial vicar, so in theory acting on behalf of the emperor, in Italy. And this was incredibly effective because first of all, it was mostly based, especially at this point, on the fact that the powers that already existed. As you've seen here, it's basically Italians that have a lot of money and pay the German rulers that also do not have much of that to be recognized as such. And the imperial vicariate came with all a set of public prerogatives that were connected with the emperor. So this is not just like the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of England that are separated, also hate each other most of the times. And so they don't have some power sharing situation unless someone is the vassal of another because of the older, let's say, feudal complications, of that part of Europe. The emperor is a super authority. And so, and the ultimate public one, so he can really delegate, especially in these areas like Italy that are incredibly advanced, civilly speaking, administratively, statally, that they have a very strong public authority, they have a very robust administration and power concentration, and therefore this enhances much more speedily, and even more in the case of Milan, a more homogeneous and compaction of these territories and their government. Gian Galeazzo's early political maneuvers included stabilizing the western frontier, we talked about before, by seizing Asti, that, as we've seen, he had banged his head against. At this point, from Secondo Ottone of Montferrat, we are in 1378. This happened through deception, a move that expanded Visconti influence and demonstrated his, Gian Galeazzo's growing diplomatic finesse. This moves, coups, regime changes were very much in the spirit of the era, because even though the Milanese had a hell of an army, and definitely the kind that could besiege and storm entire cities, it was much easier, especially in this time where there is a broader instability, some greater difficulties, to secure the control of a city by simply toppling its power, installing a friend ruling in there. And because these are increasingly fortified centers as well, there is all a seigneurial architecture in these cities starting from the mid 14th century. It basically dominates with a massive citadel the surrounding population. Already the Italian cities were heavily fortified. We've seen the towers of Bologna that were basically the standard at the time, but gradually all the families that had owned this were undermined in their power. There was a greater power concentration in a single major fortress, and a great part of these local liberties were suppressed. It was just part of a broader political and social mechanism of the crisis of the mid-14th century. Most of this power was actually delegated by the same citizenry because they were exhausted by military expenses, and they preferred, in fact, just sort of still medievally decentralized power that was surely also demanding, but still could enforce some stability, co-opting just an elite, leaving basically the rest of the people outside of politics and of arms, at least if not in peacetime, in the regularity that had been in the previous communal era of martial exercise, participation to the army. So Asti is a very important addition to the Milanese dominion. The rivalry with Bernabò reached its climax on May 6, 1385, in a meticulously planned coup that revealed Gian Galeazzo's ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. Under the pretext of a pilgrimage to the sanctuary of St. Mary of the Mountain near Varese, which is in the west of Milan, Gian Galeazzo lured Bernabò to a meeting outside Milan's Vercellis Gate, the Vercelline Gate, near the Hospital of St. Ambrose. Bernabò, suspecting no treachery, arrived on a mule with only his sons Rodolfo and Ludovico and a small retinue. Despite warnings from his allies, Gian Galeazzo, accompanied by 500 lancers led by trusted captains Jacopo dal Verme, one of the most famous condottieri of the era, because, by the way, we have just entered the Italian phase of condottieri in the 70s, from the 70s, the 80s. These are all basically Italian now, as opposed to the previous time where especially Milan had pioneered the hiring of a massive amount, but literally like some thousands of German men-at-arms. Again, this is how big, 5,000 to 6,000 even, the largest army in Europe. Maybe not even the Kingdom of France could afford that at a given moment under a single ruler. In any case, Jacopo dal Verme and other leaders like Ottone Mandelli, Bernardino Dall'Onato, Ugolotto Biancardo, and Giovanni Malaspina, executing a swift ambush. These figures would be interestingly looked at. For example, the Malaspina were a mountain house between Emilia and Tuscany that had historically provided some of the finest knights out there. Were very small signory, but they had the best men-at-arms. And these guys basically captured Bernabò and his sons. Gian Galeazzo moved decisively to consolidate power in Milan. To win public favor, he permitted the sacking of Bernabò's residences from the side of the people, interestingly enough. This, as you know, was regularized even in times of regime change, power changes, to a degree at the death of the popes, of the doges. Sometimes, like people, the local servants most could steal stuff. But this was a more sort of revenge-dictated move, and quite politically effective one, because Bernabò was very powerful. The houses were looted included the Ca di Can, near San Giovanni in Conquest. Gian Galeazzo also abolished taxes on salt, grain, linen, and iron-wheeled carts, though some were later reinstated to stabilize finances. This was an initial way to win over the grace of his own citizens. The fortresses at Milan's gates surrendered, except for the Roman gate stronghold, which fell the next day, the same plot against Bernabò, yielding 6 carts of silver and 700,000 gold florins, according to chronicler Andrea Corio. This is, the price of a major city, as a matter of fact, as Milan obviously had most of it. Consider Milan is basically the largest city in Europe here, together with Paris. We don't even know technically which one was bigger, but that Milan, we made multiple videos also about Milanese armor, had by far the most advanced, large, and qualitative arms and armor production in the entire likely world at this point, surely in Europe, and as such, it had a massive socio-economical power as well. Bernabò, as we said, was imprisoned and kept in the castle of Trezzo on the Adda River, where he died on December the 19th, 1385, reportedly poisoned with a dish of beans, though Gian Galeazzo staged solemn funerals to avoid martyring his uncle, which was also a clever move, in fact. The Council of 900 promptly named Gian Galeazzo Dominus of Milan, so Lord, which was the more conventional recognition of essentially monarchic power in the Visconti domain. Considered by this point, Visconti had secured for their own clan the dominance over Milan. It's just because of the extinction of their main line that later the Sforza will come to power, but still through the female one of the Visconti. By May 1385, most Visconti territories from Alba to Brescia, the Ticino River to Reggio in Emilia, submitted to Gian Galeazzo's rule. This was as simple as a formal declaration of obedience and recognition of his own prerogatives, so they would essentially keep paying to Milan its due. This except for Brescia's citadel, where Bernabò's son Gian Mastino, which literally means John Hound, resisted until August, surrendering for a pension of 1,000 gold florins. These names, by the way, are not random. Mastino, as you know, hound was famously used, for example, also by the La Scala in Verona. And think about Can Grande, that literally was called dog and had a dog as a crest of his in his arms, on his helm. Also, as beautifully showed at the sculptures arcs that are some of the most beautiful iconographic evidence of mid 14th century Italian arms and armor. These had to do with the idea of loyalty, the fact that hounds, dogs, wolves are loyal to the emperor, because these were all Ghibellines, right? At heart, Milan actually, if you of course think about the times of the Lombard League, was the capital of the Guelph resistance against the emperors. But ever since, in fact, the Visconti takeover was Ghibelline, and it would courageously remain so, together with most of northern Italy. If anything, we will have to make a video about Henry VII of Luxembourg's campaign, because that's the moment in which the Visconti are finally... They had already ruled. There had been an interludium with the Guelph della Torre backed by the Angevins, but at this point, these guys are imperial vicars. In fact, this was, as we saw before, given a personam, title-wise, but historically Milan had been the center of Ghibellinism in the 14th century, would remain that for a long time. So you have this acts of will by, different, here, members of the same Visconti, the house that do not recognize temporarily Gian Galeazzo, but he's able to bribe them. And as you see, they were ruling from all these different cities. Right. In particular here, Brescia's citadel, so not even the city as a whole, but still saying, we're entrenched here. Brescia is just basically in the northeast of Milan, not that far in Lombardy. With Milan under his control, Gian Galeazzo embarked on an ambitious campaign of territorial expansion and diplomatic consolidation, aiming to forge a unified northern Italian state. This was the great goal of the Visconti from quite a long time. Historically, when you look at the Lombard League, basically this was, as you know, one of the most dramatically advanced parts in the world, just like today in Europe. It's one of the richest part of the blue banana and so on. And if you look at the Milanese expansion, this, first of all, Milan had hegemonized the direction of the Lombard League, but not quite too early. Like in the 12th century, in the 13th century, still there was an idea that these Lombard cities in this flat land, well connected, well infrastructurally, sort of would cooperate, creating coalition forces that at some point were ever more sort of automatically created, to the point that Milan was rising in parallel as the de facto substitutive force. These forces would come, as we've seen, either in money or men from the other cities, and Milan, at some point by the beginning of the 14th century, has de facto substituted the Lombard League by scale of power, literally overlapping with it territorially. And after this, it had started basically expanding further. And especially in Gian Galeazzo's reign, that's why it is so important, it would reach its maximum extension. In November 1385, Gian Galeazzo formed a defensive league with Florence, Pisa, Lucca, Siena, Perugia, and Bologna to counter the contingent threat of mercenary companies that were still roaming parts of the peninsula. He contributed with a force of 1,000 lances. That was fairly a lot, especially considering, again, that Italian armies, as most armies in the Middle Ages, were coalition forces, right? And in Italy, with the nominal political fragmentation, this was even more. And so sending 1,000 lances, even though, as we've seen, the Milanese had literally the largest forces potentially available in Europe, as a normal detachment was a pretty big one. He also sent 150 crossbowmen under Bartolomeo Sanseverino. These were these emerging condottieri of the era. Again, in the video about Braccio, you can see mostly the central, partly southern Italian side of the story. This alliance, celebrated by Florentine Chancellor Coluccio Salutati as a contrast to Bernabò's support for condottieri, showcased Gian Galeazzo's ability to align with powerful city-states. Milan and Florence had been actually at war for a long time, and so Salutati was simply, flattering the ruler of Milan to say, "Okay, look, now we're friends. Can you please stop trying to invade Tuscany, please?" I, as you know, finished last in September the series about medieval Florence. So if you're interested in this period, we were pretty thorough. We went 50 years by 50 years in the end and that was already some broader introduction at the end of the day. In July 1386, Gian Galeazzo secured a 10-year alliance with the Carraresi of Padua, the Este of Ferrara, and the Gonzaga of Mantua. These signories would parry the Milanese eastern flank. These were just formal acknowledgements of sort of cooperation. There were always many intrigues across them, especially the East Polies. Again, that's I was also talking about the Gonzaga before, will emerge properly at the edges between Lombardy and northeastern Italy and other lands, even of the papacy, trying to stay alive. The Milanese wanted to mostly create some sort of buffer area between Lombardy and Venice, that, as you know, was starting to think that, after all, the Visconti were expanding too much and creating some terra firma dominion that will arrive a few tens of kilometers from Milan itself in an incredible display of efficiency. Also from a military point of view, and I made a video about the Venetian army organization during the 14th and 15th century if you're interested. The point was mostly having free hand for consolidating a western central Po Valley dominion and infiltrating all around, especially towards the south. Gian Galeazzo's ecclesiastical policy navigated the complexities of the ongoing Western schism with calculated pragmatism. Initially neutral, he leaned towards the antipope Clement VII, but reconciled with Urban VI, gaining authority over Milan's ecclesiastical appointments and the right to tax clerics to fund his daughter Valentina's lavish marriage to Louis of Valois, the Duke of Orleans, in 1389. Costing 450,000 gold florins and including the county of Asti and succession rights to Milan, as we've seen, at least the latter were entailed by the normal sort of inheritance laws, the marriage sparked public discontent due to its financial burden, but strengthened ties with France. This was important, even considering the problems that the French had during this sort of interludium of the 100 Years' War. Gian Galeazzo's suspicions of French designs on Genoa, coupled with rumors at the French court accusing Valentina of causing King Charles VI's illness, which had nothing to do with that, prompted him to threaten war with France in 1396. This is fascinating because it gives you a dimension of how powerful Milan was. That they could even literally say they could have not invaded France, like those damn Milanese do always in medieval too, and that everybody hate for a reason. You have all France eaten up by a faction, but surely could sort of threaten to revert some French influence in say in some parts of Italy. That Genoa had historically called also for some kind of French protection, also through its historical ties with Naples, the Angevins over there. But this marriage of Gian Galeazzo's daughter with the Duke of Orleans was very well, say not well, because you know how it ended. Louis of Valois was assassinated, but let's say it had a very specific purpose. That is to say, hoping that at some point their children, the Duke himself, would become king of France, and therefore conferring to the Milanese an enormous prestige at that point, maybe inheriting the same, not maybe the same French crown, but at least parts of its prestige, and so something that could be brokered and paid in exchange, because definitely these powers were in two different regional realities that, as we've seen, had also bit problems on their own, but were also literally the largest powers in the West, at least the most powerful. And in this sense, it was important for both of them to align. It would simply strengthen each other's core. But there were opportunities that eventually also put each other at odds. These tensions were exacerbated by Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, that was Bernabò's granddaughter at that point. And so she was Valentina's rival at the French court, and by the French envoy Enguerrand VII's rebuke of Gian Galeazzo's interference with Genoese affairs that the French had not liked and that the Milanese were resolute in maintaining. Genoa was literally the port of Milan ideally, right? It never quite had a direct control over the Republic of Genoa, like annexed to the Duchy or something. But indeed, they had always been gravitating around it, and Genoa was not much of a terrestrial power, so that regardless of its important overseas possessions and commercial wealth, was mostly like a naval force, and that could align with Milanese ambition to project their powers, as you've seen, even up to Sicily at a point rather than simply annexating. So we also made a video about medieval Genoa that partially explains why they were aligning with these other powers. Mostly they feared to be under a too strong influence of either of the competitors, and therefore they used to switch allegiance like that. Surely Genoa was less powerful than Milan. Speculation that Gian Galeazzo informed the Ottomans of the Crusaders' plans at Nicopolis in 1396 as retaliation is probably made up, but it underscores still Gian Galeazzo's willingness to exploit international rivalries. Evidence is naturally inconclusive. There is, however, this idea that he was in between. He was antipathetic to different powers for how powerful himself he was in this context. Gian Galeazzo's expansionist ambitions first targeted the Della Scala of Verona. I made multiple videos about Verona. We can make, if anything, one just about the Scaligers themselves, because they were one of the most important houses in Europe at that time, with, again, a military power, at least at the peak of their power in the 30s, so of the 14th century, that had gone, that was comparable to the one of Milan, and thus also, say, France. The Della Scala had sheltered Bernabò's sons, Carlo and Gianmastino, had escaped. On April 19, 1387, Gian Galeazzo allied with Francesco da Carrara of Padua and Francesco I Gonzaga of Mantua. I made videos about Padua as well, promising Verona to Milan and Vicenza to Padua. In other words, partitioning the Scaliger dominions. This was an old fantasy of the Milanese that had tried not to mingle too much, not much just in their Veronese affairs, but at least to decisively crush the Scaliger dominion because of Venice. So risking, in that case, to create a power vacuum that the Serenissima could quickly exploit. So there were these other signories, such as especially the Carrarese one that was very exposed to Venice, that would be historically more than happy to crush Verona, that had historically subjugated Padua, and hoping also of receiving Milanese assistance against Venice, the Mantuans doing something similar. On April 21st, 1387, Gian Galeazzo issued a formal challenge to Antonio della Scala, Lord of Verona. The campaign was swift. Verona fell on October the 18th of the same year after betrayal, opening the St. Maximus Gate, allowing Milanese forces under Antonio Bevilacqua and exiled Veronese to seize the city. They had essentially their own forces plus the one of the exiles that were eager to come back to Verona. Antonio della Scala fled to Venice, unsurprisingly, and 3 days later Gian Galeazzo secured Castelvecchio as well, which is just the fortress of Verona. And he then captured Vicenza as well. There's a minor Veneto commune. We can make a video about this. It had historically been controlled by the Veronese since the time of Henry VII, assigning it to his wife Caterina, daughter, in turn, of Regina della Scala. So, of course, there was an entwinement also in Lombardy with the Veneto area. This, however, meant that the Carrara did not receive Vicenza as by plan, violating the agreement stipulated with Milan. This betrayal enraged Francesco I da Carrara, who abdicated in favor of his son Francesco Novello, which means the new Francis, on June 29th of 1388. Gian Galeazzo, supported by Venice at that point, because, of course, as much as Padua was undermined, at least Venice had an easier job, and if anything, Milan at this point had screwed up and the Paduans had backfired against them, so they had to intervene, launched an offensive against Padua herself in June, the same June, 1388. Gian Galeazzo's forces, led by Jacopo del Verme, again this great condottiero, captured the city by November the 21st, at the end of the season, granting Treviso and Ceneda to Venice. These were other towns surrounding, while retaining Feltre, Belluno, and Padua, which was sort of a more continental direction, also reaching up to sort of far northeastern abodes, the Alps, the Prealps. Naturally, it's not like the Milanese could quite strongly control these easternmost areas. Nevertheless, they temporarily seized them. Francesco Novello, briefly confined in Asti, so the opposite side of the Po Plain, plotted to assassinate Gian Galeazzo, planning an ambush during his weekly hunting procession in Pavia. The plot was, however, uncovered. Remarkably, Gian Galeazzo spared Francesco Novello, granting a castle in the Asti region to him in a pension of 6,000 gold florins accordingly, which may be surprising. This leniency, however, did not prevent, Francesco Novello from aligning with Florence and Bologna, who formed the League of Bologna to counter Visconti expansion. It's a bit inexplicable as a lenient policy. In June 1390, Francesco Novello, backed by John Hawkwood, that was, as you know, the leader of the White Company, but in this case also Bernabò's son-in-law and a renowned English condottiero, to say the least, recaptured Padua, dealing a significant blow to Gian Galeazzo's Venetian ambitions. There's a very specific military history here to browse. At some point we're going to do it, because I think we never made a video about John Hawkwood, as a matter of fact. And actually, now that I think about it, it's a pretty good name on the list that I haven't inserted. Now, in 1390, Gian Galeazzo renewed alliances with Amadeus VII of Savoy and Carlo Malatesta of Rimini in the Romagnol area, preparing for a broader war with Florence and Bologna that, as we've seen, had just coalesced against him. For the usual reasons. Milanese expansionism was becoming too heavy for this areas that these two powers that control. I just recently made a video about medieval Bologna, and they control especially the Apennine passes that they led to central Italy. Bologna was more exposed because just in the Po Valley, though relatively dissented from Milan. To fund his campaigns, Gian Galeazzo increased the salt price by a quarter, imposing heavy taxes that strained his subjects. In any case, he had a hell of an army. An army that, in March 1391, led by Giovanni Dazzo degli Ubaldini, invaded Tuscany, linking with Sienese and Perugian allies. Again, I made a video about both Siena and Perugia, so you can check these moments out. And this is what I love about the channel, especially the original, the historical original series, that you can see all this history from the various political standpoints of the various powers, and this is amazing. We must really do more of this. On April the 25th, 26th of 1391, Florence and Bologna issued a formal challenge to Gian Galeazzo, accusing him of betraying his uncle, the Scaligers, the da Carrara, and alleging ambitions to dominate the entire Italy in a sort of monarchic and therefore tyrannical fashion. Hawkwood's coalition, including Francesco Novello, Carlo Visconti, and John III of Armagnac. So you have here, as a matter of fact, all some opponents of Gian Galeazzo in the moment, passed to the counteroffensive, invading Lombardy, supported by Stephen III of Bavaria, Ingolstadt, and Venetian forces as well. So there is a sort of international upheaval against Gian Galeazzo that is becoming too powerful for everybody's tastes. Gian Galeazzo countered by luring Bertrand de La Salle's 1,500 lances to his side and defeating the Armagnac at Alessandria on July the 25th, 1391. This is a very interesting exchange. The lances are historically, they evolve over time, but they are the men-at-arms, hence the lance, so to say, and then a retinue of 2, 3, depending on who they are, because there are also some foot retinues at some point, but things have mostly to yet evolve in a more consistent fashion. It's more like, in fact, 14th century still cavalry heavy reality, even though in Italian warfare at this point there is already an important amount of handguns, like 1/3 of Italian infantry at this point has already some pistols. The Armagnac, dismounted and captured by Jacopo dal Verme, died hours later. His forces were routed entirely, retreating to the Montferrat region. This was, again, a great victory. I should have perhaps made a military biography of Gian Galeazzo, but we're always in time, of course, for that. The victory, celebrated, by the way, as a triumph over foreign invaders, because these were Frenchmen, and as we've seen, that part of the Valois clan that did not quite like the Milanese postures, including the threats to France herself over the Genoese issue, was marked by 3 days of festivities across Visconti territories. It was not the first time that the Milanese had flexed muscles in front of the French. What would have become Charles V of France back in the 20s of the 14th century had invaded Lombardy, had arrived close to Milan. The Milanese show up, and the French see this host and decide to come back to France. And apparently the king, also the later king, kept remembering this, magnifying this Milanese host they had never seen, especially this enormous power of cavalry, of infantry, of all the apparatus. And I made, as you know, multiple videos about Italian communal armies, because apparently here nobody literally knows anything about the scale involved. And it's just, imagine, again, there are armies that are way more important than the ones of the 100 Years' War. Nobody told you. In 1392, Gian Galeazzo's army penetrated Tuscany, joining Sienese allies, but suffering defeats at this point at Paterno and the Nievole River against Hawkwood. Again, this condottiero in Italy was really a magnificent example of the most advanced, in fact, of the legacy probably of English armies during the 100 Years' War. This was post, naturally, Bretigny, and as you know, Hawkwood had a veritable career in Italy. He died there, but let's say he was also defeated, as a matter of fact, by some Italian forces. It's not like they were just this shockingly advanced person. Consider that here they were fighting also with Italian forces next to him, as we've just seen. It was also difficult, of course, for the Milanese to operate in Tuscany across the Apennine. A peace was, the financial costs are crashing for both sides, and these are the most typical examples we've seen protracting themselves up to the mid-15th century of this essentially Florence allied with Venice versus Milan to prevent the latter from hegemonizing the entire central northern Italy. An effort that, although coming very close here, did not really never succeeded. The balance of this happened also with Venice. Later we've seen a couple of videos, for example, Molinella, Caravaggio, in that instance, had Venice won, like probably they would have hegemonized, and we're in a later phase in the first half of the 15th century, and a bit later actually too, where Venice was more menacing in that regard even than Milan, but we're always basically at the same level. A peace mediated by Pope Boniface IX at Genoa on January 20th, 1392, recognized Gian Galeazzo's control of Feltre and Belluno in the northeast, but also confirmed Padua's return to the Decarrara, which was actually the most important aspect because Padua was a relevant center. This was a temporary setback. Undeterred, Gian Galeazzo pursued his vision of a unified northern Italian kingdom, if anything, drawing inspiration from the more power-concentrated monarchies of France and Spain. At that point, institutionally speaking, were feudal states, unlike most of the Italian ones that instead had evolved from essentially city and multi-city dominions, fundamentally, so lacked that sort of feudal core of massive estates, simply devolved to probably a more militaristic posture, even though, again, it's not like they lacked actual military power. As we've seen, it just was more unstable because it was more or less still floating on the basis of these cities rather than a specific regional core. And Milan was definitely the better equipped state to consolidate on that basis, which it's going is exactly what it's going to do here. In 1394, Gian Galeazzo allied himself with Charles VI of France, once again, and Amadeus VIII of Savoy, eyeing control of Genoa once again, though negotiations collapsed when France prioritized once again its own conquest over the city, and at that point Gian Galeazzo decided not to push more than much. On May 11th, 1395, Gian Galeazzo secured the title of Duke of Milan from Wenceslaus for 100,000 gold florins. This was formalized in a grand ceremony at St. Ambrose on September the 5th, attended by Imperial Representative Benesius. This is a turning point in Milanese history because Milan evolved from a signory, a city signory over these other territories, into an actual duchy. Right? Doesn't even cost too much if you think about it. Yes, it's just a title, but it basically confers the Visconti a much more confident posture in international relations. Now, they are a veritably recognized imperial, Holy Roman imperial power within a feudal hierarchy, so they're much more sort of even at the pace of kings like that. In all this, there is a Milanese mystique that we will see in other videos, if anything, revolving around, again, being the de facto kings of Italy. If anything, because they were ruling from the same places where historically the Italic kingdom had been established and ruled from. In any case, for that, you needed more, if anything, because the German rulers had historically now if not the precedence, at least the habit of being connected with that crown, and they did not want to see this challenge would have ignited too many conflicts. Even though the German rulers also didn't show up very often anymore, and preferred, in fact, to invest these imperial bikers with even feudal titles within the imperial hierarchy. Consider that the duchy here corresponds to other duchies, like, I don't know, the one of Saxony, the one of Bavaria, the one of Austria. So we're talking sort of the most important pieces of princely authority in this regional space across the Alps. A second diploma on October the 13th, 1396 extended ducal authority to all Visconti territories, which means that this duchy was not merely a title of duke attributed to Gian Galeazzo, but an actually recognized, again, territorial state. This appointment also established, finally, a better outlined inheritance system, with male primogeniture as the criterion of succession, and elevated Pavia to a county, in fact, for Gian Galeazzo's heir, reinforcing the dynastic structure. What is fascinating is that historically, of course, all these places had been counties, but for some reason after the communal era that had the need to reinforce the idea that the district was also a county as well, which is in fact overlapped exactly with the Pavese district. That was also back in the day, mostly like the see of a bishop count, like the Toyan time. And it still was, at least the concept was reinforced by the emperor, and that's how things proceeded legally, institutionally, in later Middle Ages, still. In 1397, Gian Galeazzo created the county of Angera, linking it to Visconti mythology through the legendary Anglo, that was son of Aeneas, genealogical fiction promoted by court scholars. We are in the age of humanism, of classicism, etc. In Angera, there is a very strong rock that sort of represents their Milanese power. Gian Galeazzo's court intellectuals, including Guglielmo Centauri, bishop of Pavia, drew on jurists like Baldus of the Ubaldi. These were some of the most important scholars of the Bolognese glossarist tradition, to advocate for a regal title. These were also relatively novel concepts that had developed with the, in fact, consolidation of more robust regional states in Italy, and the local jurists were, in fact, the promoters of, like, at least they worked for these powers, and they had to give some legal foundation to the affirmation of these more robust states. The regal title is what we're saying about the italic crown there, the iron one, articulating a vision of strong principality that would transcend communal divisions and ensure peace in a veritably monarchic and de facto national, if anything, Lombard sense. In 1399, Gian Galeazzo acquired Pisa from Gerardo Leonardo Piani. Pisa had a ruinous decline in the second half of the 14th century. Naturally, I made two videos about medieval Pisa as well, just for the city, by the way, standalones, and they had been taken over by Florence. They, with some sort of pulsion of autonomy, opened the gates to the Visconti troops, and they temporarily break free, at least from the Florentines. This happened with Siena on September the 6th. We are at the apex, properly, of Gian Galeazzo's power. These are very big cities, like Pisa, Siena are some of the most important banking centers in Europe. They are historically, again, without this, Florence has severe problems, including and especially the one of accessing the sea, which Florence did not have, being sort of a quite continental northeastern reality. The Arno mouth is dominated by Pisa. The Sienese had historically maintained the only Tuscan Guelph opening in fact, in southern Tuscany, because the Pisan district was very much latitudinally developing, covering most of the Tuscan coast. So Gian Galeazzo is de facto choking Florence. There is also a very, and here we're making it simple. Again, perhaps in a sort of more militarily detailed biography, we can look at how here the incredibly precarious power balance of this all from both sides. There is a massive chapter that nobody adequately discusses, that is in 1401, the Battle of Brescia, where Gian Galeazzo's forces defeated Emperor Rupert III in the vicinity of the same city in Lombardy. Rupert III is a very interesting figure. He was ruler of the Palatinate. We've seen this recently in the German regional series. Gian Galeazzo was crowned by yet another great success on June the 26th, 27th, 1402, triumphing at Casalecchio, capturing Bologna with the aid of Jacopo dal Verme. So he fenced off an imperial attack that was trying to put an end to his control. For naturally, Germany is a mess when you say imperial here. It's again, these powers were barely, competitive with the same Duchy of Milan alone, but they could gather forces temporarily to invade south of the Alps. Bologna is seized as a papal city. You have this important condottieri distinguishing themselves at the control of Gian Galeazzo, such as Alberico da Barbiano and Facino Cane. These are some, again, of the most famous condottieri of their era. This brought Gian Galeazzo closer to his dream of a Lombard Empire. Gian Galeazzo's domestic reforms were transformative, reshaping the Visconti state administrative, cultural, infrastructural landscape. He could have never achieved such enormous territorial expansion and military success without a statal political reform. This is typical, really, of all the great successful armies and rulers in history. In 1386, Gian Galeazzo initiated the construction of the Duomo of Milan, granting the so-called Veneranda Fabrica exclusive access to the Candoglia marble quarries, creating one of Italy's largest and most iconic churches, a testament to Visconti grandeur. Naturally, it would take centuries before this would be finished, actually up to the 19th. Anyhow, this is a masterpiece of a very specific Italian Gothic style that looks at all the various cultural influences present in Milan at the time. Gian Galeazzo fortified Milan's defenses, rebuilding the fortifications of the Ticino Gate in 1387, the Vercelli one in 1392, and constructed a small darsena within the Ticino Gate to facilitate trade via the Naviglio. Milan was essentially almost a city on water. It had lots of canals born to drain like the major riverways of the Po Valley in the area, but ending up to create essentially a massive hydrological defense around Milan, like a massive moat. This took a hell of properly of engineering, which definitely the Milanese were the best equipped in the world at that to employ. In 1389, Gian Galeazzo oversaw the reconstruction of Piacenza's northern citadel, one of the largest in its domain. Piacenza dominates there the passage from Lombardy to Emilia across the Po River, so since Roman times it had a massive strategic relevance. As we've seen here, the Milanese army routinely invade Tuscany, and this largely happens from Emilia. We've seen also the capture of Bologna from the other end of the region, and Piacenza is fairly close to Milan, in fact, as well. Around 1390, Gian Galeazzo commissioned the Cala del Sasso, Europe's longest staircase connecting Valstagna to Asiago, enhancing regional connectivity as well. So again, other massive feats of medieval engineering pioneered by the Visconti. Gian Galeazzo's most ambitious engineering project was, however, the bridge dike at Valleggia on the Mincio River, built between 1393 and 1395 at the cost of over 300,000 gold florins. This is a massive investment designed to properly divert the Mincio and Brenta rivers to weaken Mantua and Padua. All right. This is very interesting. During sieges at point, like the course of rivers was deviated. This, especially in the Po Valley, was literally developing specific pioneers and technicians, engineers, etc. in the northern Italian armies. This massive structure, 650 meters long, 21 meters wide, and 8 meters high, integrated with the Scaliger Seraglio defenses, was one of the era's most impressive fortified bridges ever conceived. In 1392, following a revolt in Alessandria, Gian Galeazzo constructed a citadel on the rock, the citadel of Valenza, to secure his western territories as well. So a massive work of stabilization, of defense, of protection, of connection, of communication, drastically enhancing also the already gigantic Milanese power industry, army, and so on. In 1396, Gian Galeazzo began the construction of the famous Certosa in Pavia, envisioned as a dynastic mausoleum to rival the great religious foundations of Europe. He expanded the Visconti castle at Pavia, begun by his father, making it his preferred residence and seat of his court. Another powerful instrument of control on the city in this case. The adjacent Viscontian Park, also initiated by Galeazzo II, was vastly enlarged, serving as both a pleasure ground and a symbol of Visconti power. Right? Think about the Battle of Pavia being fought in the park of the Villa of Mirabello, as a matter of fact. Here you can fully appreciate not just Visconti's power, but the degree, the royal degree of the same. The fortification of cities, the control, like the Visconti had been the most advanced in this, affirming a much more stable authoritarian seigneury over most of their domains. Within the castle of Pavia, Gian Galeazzo also amassed a vast library enriched with manuscripts from conquests, including a collection of Petrarch's codices seized from the Da Carrara in 1388. This is ironic because, as we've seen, legend says that Petrarch had sort of, endowed Gian Galeazzo with the dove coat of arms, and Petrarch ended up, as you know, dying in Padua, where most of his library had been located. And the history is a bit complicated, but to make the long story short, Gian Galeazzo manages to seize the remains of that when he captured the city, as we've seen, during his conquests. The Viscontian Sforza library, which grew to over 900 illuminated manuscripts by the late 15th century, was a cultural treasure of the era. Though much of it was plundered by Louis XII in 1499 and dispersed to France and beyond, because, as we've seen, Louis claimed that, all the stuff belonged to him as much as everything Visconti Sforza by inheritance, historical. Gian Galeazzo's governance reforms centralized authority. He established the Secret Council and the Justice One to oversee state administration. This meant more political control, but also some more shadowy forces, intelligence net, etc., to prevent, as we've seen, plots, right, coups and so on. He restructured finances under the chamber and appointed general masters of the income of taxes to manage military expenditures, in particular, because the actual engine of this all is the Milanese army funding system, which is the one that gets other wealth from the neighbors. A system credited, in fact, with creating one of the first modern bureaucracies with the aid of Chancellor Francesco Barbavara. The University of Pavia, elevated to a general studium, by Boniface IX, became a leading center for legal and ideological development, attracting scholars like Manuel Chrysoloras. These were Byzantines, Peter Philagus. This would be Philagus, later Pope Alexander V, and Antonio Loschi, whose Invectiva in Florentinos defended Visconti rule against Florentine republicanism. And that's where you get the straight definition of Milanese tyranny as something positive, like a monarchic, princely, authoritarian, feudal model is better, it's more effective than a Florentine. Well, in that sense, it was true. Like the Milanese were building the truer state among all the Italian states. Thanks to this, they were the strongest in military terms and beyond. You understand how much culture there is also the Milanese court in this pre-Renaissance period. Surely the Milanese themselves are sensitive to humanism, as also witnessed by Gian Galeazzo's library. The Duke's ecclesiastical policy was equally assertive, curtailing clerical immunities and subjecting religious institutions to state oversight. He required his approval for benefices, exerting pressure on the papacy while remaining neutral in the Western Schism to secure favorable appointments. The objective, both in lay and ecclesiastical affairs, was to homogenize, uniform, very innovative, forward way of thinking. Enormous territory, what you have to do, you have to normalize the differences. You have to make things flow more smoothly. It's not like every city here worked in the same way, nor it would, because this is still a traditional mechanism where, especially the Italian communes, their states already existing within their polity, their institution, were very good, first of all, for favoring this process already as a starting point, but they still were historically different from one another. The relations between the city, the district, the feudal nobility, the various also rural communities was a very complex thing. So you couldn't quite simply in the early 15th century uniforming everything to some, I don't know, Napoleonic standard. It was impossible. But the Milanese, and in particular this great ruler of Gian Galeazzo, succeeded in bringing this to unprecedented heights. Gian Galeazzo patronized churches like the Carmine in Milan and Pavia and supported the aforementioned Certosa, commissioning masterpieces like the Little Office by Giovannino de Grassi. This was a pinnacle of Lombard illumination. His fiscal policies, however, were burdensome. All this had a heavy cost. Ordinary taxes were supplemented often by extraordinary levies, forced loans and monetary manipulations on silver, especially in times of military emergencies, such as the invasion of Lombardy at the hand of the Armagnac or Rupert of the Palatinate, that in any case successfully brought to the rejection, the defeat of the enemy armies, also in pretty clamorous battles, and this also internationally contributed to stabilize Milanese politics. In any case, these costs were such that they sparked unrest among the Milanese subjects, the Visconti subjects, let's say better, because technically, again, it's the Visconti that rule as lords and dukes over different cities. Milan at this point is de facto the center. The Visconti used mostly Milanese personnel in administration, etc., that had been the mechanism since the very start. However, it's like Milan is Milan and say, I don't know, Piacenza is Piacenza. They don't overlap. That there isn't that stepping up of the individual commune and district at that level of political and institutional development. Gian Galeazzo's ambition to create a Lombard kingdom was articulated by court intellectuals that had to propagandize this ideologically. They saw in Gian Galeazzo's rule a means to unify Italy's fragmented polities under a strong principality, a vision that clashed with Florence's republican ideals and fueled a decade-long conflict marked by military, diplomatic, and even literary battles, as we've seen. One of the earliest videos I've ever made on Schwerpunkt was about the aforementioned Salutati's work and this contrast, because he, as we've seen, was praising the Milanese as long as they helped the Florentines against some rowdy mercenary company across the peninsula. But Salutati was also the guy who fought against, as we've seen, other authors in Milan, such as the one of the Invectiva in Florentinas, exactly over this ideological view of power. It's incredibly relevant to appreciate the long-sightedness of Milanese sort of ideal of political unification, at least of the Italic kingdom. And from there, like anyone controlling central northern Italy unitarily would have taken over an enormous amount of power, including the south. It would have been like back in the 8th century, before the Carolingian invasions. Longobards were about to take over the entire peninsula. So, of course, we are in 14th, 15th century. The Longobard ideal is not necessarily there. It's a bit masked by actually the Romanizing and, if anything, classicistic tendency that did not, as we've seen also in the videos about humanism, looking really at the barbarian past and praising that. But there is no doubt that in the Milanese ethos, that Lombard identity and sort of especially more tightly civilized, kind of politically concentrated idea of kingdom, of realm, had historically survived. Never really made a video about the connection across the centuries, because it was just half of a millennium before in one of marvelous civilization in Lombardy, so you can't help but seeing the continuity that in Italy historically had always been very strong since also Roman times. And so I made videos explaining countless times how Longobards actually were light years ahead in terms of state building compared to the Franks, to aside from the size and the mechanisms that in fact did allow for a more civil development as opposed to a militaristic one that just the Franks had by the scale. They would allow them to conquer basically everybody else in Europe. But not just the Franks, of course, created the Holy Roman Empire as based in Italy and on the Lombard crown, Italic crown, and the Roman imperial one. But they dramatically drew from northern Italy. We were talking about it the other day also for the video about medieval Bologna, the legal center of medieval Europe. Frederick Barbarossa like investing so much in the Constitutio Habita to preserve that community, to revive Roman law, a more centralized idea of rule and so on. There aren't, as far as I know, many studies on this topic. Perhaps, again, the bridge between a more orderly and tidy Lombard development in the Po Valley, which, I mean, to people, the Longobards are just the barbarians. And this underscores the level of radical historiographical ignorance, basically in any trace of, in fact, historical accuracy or knowledge about the topic, the people, the history, the state, whatever. Because lesser people essentially enjoy, inferior cultures. They think that in order to be cool, you have to be lesser people. And that's exactly the opposite of what actually happens in history. In fact, they project a level of development that is just the same, like the idea that things work without a state. Well, good luck with that, because I don't know any civilization in the world that worked without a state. Even were we to talk about the approximate state of the very decentralized feudal Frankish world, that was a much more administratively developed system than anything, say, they had, I don't know, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom later on for centuries. So, unfortunately, these videos are often misunderstood, not appreciated. When it comes especially to Italy, I noticed that people don't seem like, you see, I made these videos every day, and I can immediately see who watches what. There is a vacuum of views. It's as if especially the idea of civilization stemming from the... I don't know whether it's because, I don't know, they think it's not really like a country or a state where they just do not understand power concentration in history. They just have no clue about what that means. And there is an anti-civilizational feeling to that. Right, you can't. I mean, if a place has the best life, has the best army, has the best technology, has the best industry, it has the best everything. The question is, where is the alleged kind of inferior? Say the superiority of a more inferior model by definition. That's the actual issue that I understand that because it's people by instinct sympathize with the barbarian. We all do. But then there is reason that shows you that the greatest power wielded, including the one that crushed the barbarian, that civilized the barbarian, and made things better for everybody involved, is actually not the barbarian. And it's something that you must also try to attain if you want to man up to begin with, right? But as long as you have the emotionalistic sort of primitivistic, like fringe paranoia, where living at the outskirts of the world as a alienated in poverty and underdevelopment, like from I don't know, like, do you like that? Well, enjoy it. I don't know what to say it to a degree in terms of historical tastes in particular. Now, to conclude this video, Gian Galeazzo's death on September the 3rd, 1402, from fever, possibly plague or malaria, in the castle of Milagnano, preceded by a comet, interpreted as an ill omen, evidently abruptly halted his grand vision. This is kind of a pity in historical terms, because also the unification of at least the former lands of the Italic kingdom that were still standing as part of this realm in the Holy Roman Empire were an enormous concept of this aforementioned statal and civil continuity. Gian Galeazzo's will, drafted in 1401 and amended on August the 25th, 1402, divided his dominions among his heirs. Giovanni Maria, aged 14, inheritors were not, as we've seen, he didn't have male heirs, but he had other, relatives. Giovanni Maria inherited the ducal title and core territories. He had to split these, painful enough, and that's, in fact, how we were saying this Visconti. This is exactly the weakness of the Visconti mechanism. This did stem, indeed, from the lack of a feudal development as well. That's actually the problem. The lack of that core of dynastic connection could secure everything at the same time, but still a massive core territory that basically corresponds to mostly all of that dominion: Milan, Cremona, Como, Lodi, Piacenza, Parma, Reggio, Bergamo, Brescia, Bologna, Siena, produced almost everything, even up to central Italy. Then Filippo Maria, that, as you know, will become also the last of the Visconti to rule as a male. His daughter will marry the Sforza, and so the Sforza dynasty began. Filippo Maria was 10 at the time, by the way, received Pavia and peripheral cities: Novara, Vercelli, Tortona, Alessandria, Verona, Vicenza, Feltro, Belluno, and Bassano. These were all the western and eastern fringes. Plus Pavia as a symbol of, remember that this is a power-sharing situation, that Pavia is a capital, de facto, even though Milan was obviously the most important center, was to be considered. This guy was a minor, so obviously somebody else was ruling for him, but there was this almost Solomonic repartition to content, in theory, everyone. And all these cities were held as vassals of the duchy, because now there is a duchy. This is not like in the previous generations, in which there is just a signory that claims lordship over here and there. Here there is a duchy, and even though that power sharing must happen because it's not like you create a duchy by name and simply things get unitarily ruled, right? So you have, like also in other countries, in the same feudal countries, as you know, there were lots of wars because of this splits, at least a vassalage relation that identifies who is more subjected to whom. Then you have Gabriele Maria, that was his legitimized son with Agnese Mantegazza, so a natural child, whom he was given Pisa and Crema, just small Pisa in Tuscany, and as we've seen, precariously in the hands of the Milanese. Crema is just yet another very close city to Milan, not really a great power base, but he thought of the son of his, probably also because he thought of the ones who had died, and he wanted really to have a male heir. And if anything, he had in the form of a natural son. Under the regency of Caterina, assisted by a council including Francesco Barbavara, that, as we've seen, was stiffening probably the spiritual and the politological idea of Visconti power, Jacopo dal Verme as a military commander for the Iron Fist and others that had served Gian Galeazzo in life, the duchy fragmented as condottieri and former lords, such as the da Carrara in Padua, reclaimed territories. This is really typical at every dynastic crisis, like in this case, with no clairs and no strong heirs in adulthood, in legitimate ones even, you have a shrinking of power and some also in internal clash. Now, interestingly enough, the 1889 examination of Gian Galeazzo's tomb in the Certosa of Pavia revealed he stood approximately 1.86 meters tall, with reddish blonde hair, a commanding presence for his era. Gian Galeazzo's legacy, marked by centralized governance, cultural patronage, and territorial ambition, endured, but the fragility of his empire, reliant on his personal authority, led to its rapid disintegration, setting the stage for the tumultuous wars of Italy, at least in a really very broad perspective. His vision of a unified northern Italy in particular, though unrealized, left an indelible mark on the political and cultural landscape, influencing the trajectory of the Visconti and their Sforza successors. After all, Milan had already partially succeeded in obtaining that result historically, because the northwest of Italy was already, like Lombardy, the most advanced part of the peninsula. There is no doubt about this. So Milan, in and of itself, was very much like a kingdom of some sort. If you look at even just by size, regardless of the floating boundaries, like a pretty vast domination, right? There were some kingdoms in Europe that were not as big as the Visconti dominion, the Duchy of Milan at this point under Gian Galeazzo, and we're talking in any case of the by far greatest population, manpower, wealth concentration in the entire continent. So literally, aside from the territorial size, literally the greatest concentration of power. At the same time, this is true also for the neighbors. This is something that is often misunderstood, even about the balanced power in Italy during also the Renaissance, etc., that this system, if you really look at that later, it's not like it was uniformly taken over. All right, normally politically fragmented areas are the weaker ones, right? And it's not like Italy will not be weak, vulnerable at least, because of political fragmentation, especially because it was so rich and everybody wanted to take it over. But there isn't such a thing like a takeover. There's not a fringe here that is subsumed in another kingdom and is cancelled. These are fully fledged states that basically also during the Italian wars will end up largely remaining independent, as a matter of fact, but also negotiating, in the sense, a continuous power balance within the same peninsula that the foreign powers that dominated on some parts of the same were dependent on. And this mechanism, again, I can't think of a specific other one. It's true that, say, traditionally speaking, rulers were always very dependent on in fact, local powers, etc. But in this sense, we're looking at an incredibly, again, concentrated system in terms of wealth, the highest per capita wealth in the world, the greatest demographic concentration in the world at the same time. You can't simply, say, conquer or annexate this display. And the Duchy of Milan, paradoxically, would be the only one that was fundamentally taken over in that way, because it was so well organized that it allowed for a better internal control. So that when you took it over, you could essentially at least take over the state, and obviously was run also in the administration, etc., still by locals. But at least, as you know, that was one of the overall, still the most important, but the relatively few places was simply annexated by a foreign power. And it has to do with the strategic cruciality of it. It's difficult to talk about this era because there are so many things that are not obvious at all. And this part of history seemingly is like very chaotic. I personally come from the early 14th century, so I'm not scared by anything. Like, people think that the 14th century is a nightmarish century to study and that everything is a mess. And it is really true. But once you start seeing the inherent logic of this mechanism, you start realizing that it wasn't much of a sort of strange system at all. You just have to study, yes, the history of every place, especially in this fractal international scenario, but as a regional one in this case. But still, like, once you do, you know that it was a reality, and reality works in a way because, you know, of some reason. And that's what you have to find out. It's a lot of work. Anyhow, it's also quite rewarding. The history of Milan here, I see on Schwerpunkt how many videos have we made on Milan. probably not enough. This is the 15th on Schwerpunkt. It's too few. We need really way more. In several years, especially considering that some of the videos are very old, we made really few. We should really make way more. The reason also quite simply being that it's such overall an important polity that you can't, and these are just also relatively eccentric videos. We have to make something perhaps about the Lombard League, about also the early Visconti. They're very, very interesting. We did, I think, something more about medieval Lombardy. Well, of course more, but how more? Well, not much. This is only the 20th video, medieval Lombardy. Ouch. We really have to make way more. At that point, we will understand really what matters better. Yeah, so let's prepare more videos about the Lombard League, Milan, and all different Lombard cities. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.